excited to talk about our political tradition. So yeah, this is a great topic that we probably do every year or so, and for good reason. I'm going to try and do something a little bit different this time around than how we usually cover this topic. Instead of doing the what of our political tradition, I'd like to talk about the why of our political tradition. There really isn't a sufficient substitute that I can offer for the articles that Steve wrote for this week, or not for this week, but that were assigned for this week. The two articles that Steve penned are great, and everyone should read them. They should be required reading for membership, honestly. But I'm going to try and motivate why the history of our tradition is important to the interventions we make in our immediate current climate, why we study it, and how it guides every decision we make. The first significant split between the tradition that the DC is part of goes way back to Karl Marx and his establishment of scientific socialism. Before Marx, the only kind of political theory that could be related to socialism was that of the utopian variety. The idealism of utopian socialism comes in sharp conflict with the materialism of scientific socialism. The utopians had the brilliant epiphany of we should have an egalitarian society, which, that's a great idea, but lacked any kind of strategy of how to bring that about, besides some pretty wild and gross regurgitations of capitalist ideology, like we should, give all the money to the rich people and let them make the decisions. Marx is the first person to bring about a material analysis in regards to how to achieve this ideal society. Marx examines how we make stuff, what we call the means of production, how society is stratified, what we call class, around how we make stuff, which is what we call class, and produces a socialism based in science. Thus, the distinction between materialism and idealism is born, at least in politics. As Marx so brilliantly puts it, it is not consciousness that determines social being, but social being that determines our consciousness. We can begin to understand all political currents, traditions, and movements through this fundamental lens. Arguably, there is nothing more necessary for the intelligence of our interventions than understanding this distinction. Holding a material analysis in lieu of an idealist analysis means that we look at the material world, its structure and fluctuations, as the source of our understanding and not the abstract values. When we look at the question of fascism, we don't determine whether or not we live in a fascist state based on who believes what. Ultimately, this necessarily leads to endless conjecture about people we don't like. Rather, we looked at current economic situation, the organizational maturity of working class institutions, and the popularity of socialist platform ideas. We don't look to the working class as the agent of world liberation because they're the coolest, smartest, and most attractive. Although we are the most attractive, but because of the structural position that we hold in the capitalist machine. This is the foundation of our tradition, that of materialism over idealism. The reason we oppose working with the Democrats and fight for class independence is not because Democrats are evil liars, even though they are also this, but because of the ways the Democratic Party relates to production, the way that as an institution, the Democratic Party is an agent for capitalist hegemony within the broader economic structure. Our response to, well, my uncle is a cop and he is a good person, should be that he very well may be a good person, but that is entirely not the point. The position that cops hold as strikebreakers and armed enforcers of property relations supersedes the abstraction of them being good people or not. It simply isn't relevant. Understanding our political tradition also aids us against the analysis of what could be referred to, or what I refer to as solipsism. The idea that everything is infinitely relative and we can't know anything because everything has changed since the last time we thought about it. We hear lots and lots of this kind of discussion when engaging with DSA and other expressions of reformism. The local DSA isn't national DSA, and this candidate isn't the same as the last candidate. Or my favorite, this election is different and more important. This ahistorical analysis of different things are different is used time and time again to disorient the working class into some really wild takes. Through our political tradition, we are able to draw similarities and comparisons between the pressing questions of today and what history has taught us about these questions. Not having a foundation in this history leaves one to nauseating vertigo of whatever crock of shit the ruling class decides to feed people today, such as the false binary that AI is either going to ruin the world or save the world. History teaches us differently. I'm reminded of the IMT defending its line of support for cop unions by essentially saying cops are different in different contexts, and we shouldn't paint with too broad a stroke. Of course, we should be exact and specific in our analysis, but this does not necessitate not knowing anything at all. We must be adaptable and understanding, but we also must maintain a political center that is unwavering in its indictment of the current expression of imperialism, colonialism, racism, etc. There has been, currently is, and will continue to be vast disagreements on the left of whether or not a political tradition even matters in our present organizing. Some would argue that political principles should be subordinated to common activity, that building infrastructures of dissent should be placed before points of unity. Of course, we want both. We want to grow in scope and size. Without that growth, our organizing means nothing. But where the rubber meets the road, political clarity and agreement must be prioritized over unity. There isn't a better example of this than the meeting Chelsea and I went to last week at the Unitarian Church that Justin was at as well. A large part of the room, including those who hosted the event, were insistent on, we must unite. A smaller but vocal part of the room wanted to know around what exactly we were uniting. Specifically, what are the strategic points that we are agreeing to be in unity with, and what is the political foundation of these points? Our political tradition teaches us that these points of unity are the basis for organizing, not the cherry on top, but the whole purpose of organizing to maintain that political clarity. In order to be effective in these big tent spaces, we must be well-versed in what those tension points are and how to navigate them. This can only come through study of the history of our movements and how these tensions have played out. Yes, this means that at times we'll be forced to sacrifice growth. We make that sacrifice with confidence, knowing that our organizational foundation must be solid before we can make any real headway into the class in the class struggle. Unfortunately, we are at a moment where the revolutionary left is in relative shambles, but we won't get out of this mess by fusing ourselves to the next elected politician that puts universal health care on the t-shirt. This process can be incredibly frustrating, but it's a necessary one. Our political tradition can give us almost eerie foresight. Some would say psychic as to how certain organizational dynamics play out. We aren't just guessing when we are wary of socialists who don't explicitly denounce Stalin and the state capitalism of socialism in one country. The strategy of organizing that the PSL employs with its top-down, dictatorial, and sectarianist tendencies is no accident, but a direct lineage of their tradition of Stalinism. The PSL feels fully validated in its bully tactics and outright violence towards other socialists who don't get in line with how they want to do things. It's not even that they aren't afraid to snitch on unruly protesters. They feel it is their revolutionary duty to squash dissent by any means necessary. If they had the political power, they would be utilizing it in the same way that Stalin did, and pose a much more serious security threat than we are currently facing with the Trump administration. Of course, it would be criminal to have a talk of our political tradition without talking about the ISO. Firebrand is in the same tradition of the ISO and came from the International Socialist Organization. The weaknesses of the ISO and the IST were what led to the dissolution of the ISO. The top-down authority, abusive leadership, the opportunism of the ISO, especially around the Bernie campaign, and finally the cover-up of rape. The ISO had weaknesses. This is clear. But by distancing ourselves from the tradition that we do come from, we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes that the ISO made. Some post-ISO reformations act like they were never in the ISO and defensively insist that they are something completely new. Not only is this just not true, it's an incredibly damaging precedent to set moving forward. If we are ever to build a revolutionary organization worthy of the name, we must confront our organizational mistakes head on. This means having discussions just like this one, but explicitly engage in our tradition with a critical eye and not ignoring the history that we are embarrassed of. Hiding from our mistakes only allows those same mistakes to be repeated in future formations. I hope this talk has engaged members as to why the history that Steve's documents presents is necessary and worthy of discussion. Why we must turn fighters into thinkers and thinkers into fighters, not only for our own personal political development, but as necessary for the integrity of Firebrand and whatever formation comes after it. I hope you will join in building the next organization in our tradition.